I greet you all from South Africa, Johannesburg, and this is our episode of bringing together our second conversation in the Southern Hemisphere. We have chapters represented from our Association of Change Management at the global level, where we are looking at the Southern African and renamed recently from South Africa to Southern Africa, colleagues from Australia, New Zealand, and even in our Singapore chapter as well. So a bit of an agenda going on over here. Some of the faces you might recognize from our previous conversation when we recorded our first webinar. Dr. Aiden Thornton from Australia National University, Brad Rillett, who was involved with our in the background and doing the role that I'm playing this time. So we're just showing you that we are adaptable and that what we do is we can kind of pass the baton around and amongst each other. And then a newcomer today is Max Teixeira. He's going to be joining us from Sydney, Australia. And behind the scenes is Radan Kucherik. And what we're going to be doing today is delving into a conversation amongst friends. We've designed this as a kind of a collaborative conversation. We're learning as we're going, and it's never a done deal. Because even as we're speaking, the world is changing. And I kind of call that the new wineskin world. And I'm just going to kind of position our conversation today very briefly. We are going to be unbundling this question, the implications of implementing generative AI in complex and interconnected organizations. Now, traditionally, we've always looked at it and said, you know what, we've got hindsight. We can look back and we can identify what went wrong, so that helps us with our risk. We've got foresight, which talks to the strategy and its unrolling forward. You've got insight, which is our business as usual. And we're quite good at thinking we got our business as usual, which is, under compliance, so it's oversight. But I want to stretch us today. So before I hand over to Max as our first presentation and discussion and conversation, I want to just give you some more sight opportunities. The first sight opportunity is beyond foresight. And the stretcher we're going to put on today is next sight. What's happening around the corner? What's happening beyond foresight? What's happening the day after, tomorrow after? What I call the better next. And at the same time, if you've got oversight, well, then I want to invite my colleagues to interrogate undersight. Why and what is happening under the water? So as we see these questions around implications and so on, what does it mean for the people, for the processes, for the systems, the products? And then we know that innovation happens on the side, on the peripheral, on the edge. So I'm going to position the third sight that I want us to cover off is side sight. And think of your peripheral vision. So our speakers are going to be talking to undersight, they're going to be talking to next sight, and they're going to be talking to side sight. And the last one that I'm going to give as a preface to our kickoff with Max is this idea of whole sight. But we never are able to see the whole. What I am going to say is I'm going to position a quote from an African Senator, Crystal Osiki, who is in Kenya, and she is a visually impaired young disabled woman who has been voted into their Kenyan parliament. And she said this: if all you see is all you see, then you don't see all there is to be seen. Max, I'm going to ask you to take us through our first introductory check and challenge and a provocation. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Rory. Really appreciate that introduction. Yeah, interesting. So many sites to think about. And when we think about the whole site, like we can't get a full overview of that. But if we think about organizations, the theme of our webinar today, we've got this whole idea of putting generative AI into complex and adaptive organizations. Then that whole site is something that's really difficult for us because we operate in a really adaptive organization. It's comprised of a whole load of moving parts, and so thinking about those different sites is probably quite a useful thing to do, absolutely. All right, so what I might start off with is, this question, demystifying generative AI projects, what's different and how do we succeed? I'm kind of looking at this, if we look at this with a bit of an idea around that, understanding how generative AI projects are different from traditional technology-driven change, it'll help us work more successfully with Gen AI. And so with that in mind, I wanted to take a few minutes just to take us through 8 or so different differences between what generative AI projects are like and what traditional projects are like, and maybe talk about the so what that provides us in terms of how we might consider working with generative AI as we move forward, which might be a little bit of the side site, really. And so moving to the first content slide, what's different about generative AI? The first thing that I kind of want to bring to your attention is accessibility. Generative AI is really accessible by nearly everyone. If you asked anyone, everybody uses some form of generative AI, whether it's ChatGPT or Perplexity, etc. So it's really, really ubiquitous. And whereas if you're trying to put in an ERP system or a technology change, then not everybody has access to that to start off with. And so it is quite different from that perspective. And just because it's so accessible, there's a tendency for enterprises to think about where we could use this everywhere across our supply chain and add value. And so the challenge then becomes, well, where should you really apply this? Just because you can doesn't mean that you really should. There's a risk reward equation here. So, because these systems aren't always as predictable as you might like them to be, there's a risk reward if you put this into whichever part of the supply chain you put it into. So, if you're putting it into a customer facing area, you might be thinking you might get a lot of rewards from that. But also the other thing to consider here is um, the risks are also quite high, right? And so, all of us have dealt with putting in technology into organizations, and the risk can be quite high. And so, if you put it into a customer facing and it doesn't quite work the way you expect it to, the risk, while the rewards might be high, the risk could be high. Whereas if you put it into a back office area, you might still get some efficiencies and with potentially less risk. And so the first thing really, the so what around this is understand the risk reward equation for different parts of your business and making sure that you fully understood the level of risk you're applying in terms of which part of the supply chain you're putting it into. And so organizations that take that structured approach are more likely to succeed with generative AI. That's one of the things we're seeing. And so that's kind of the first one. I'll jump on to the next one, and this is a really interesting one. When we think about generative AI, we think of it as kind of new. It's a new area, and it's all emerging. And so when you think about the types of skills you need to do it, the sort of thing that comes to mind are those new skills that are out there as part of the whole buzz, like prompt engineering. You need prompt engineering skills to get Gen AI to work, and might need machine learning or machine ops skills. And those things are true. You do need those. But there's a whole load of traditional skills that have been there as part of technology-driven change in the past that actually remain really relevant and actually come to the foreground. Things like data science and understanding how neural networks work. Those things are quite important as prompt engineering. Also, project management skills, ensuring that things don't go over budget. That's as equally as important as it ever was. And what's probably more important is the idea that the business owners or your business owner role is more critical than it's ever been. It really is, because success depends on convening the right skills, getting them into a room, and creating an environment for those right skills to operate effectively. And so with that, that's the sort of thing that we really need to think about, and that's part of this side site that Rory mentioned, you know. Um, Employee adoption, that's the next one on the list. And of course, employee adoption, you know, when we think about traditional change, um, typically you design the change and you try and help the organization understand the change. And so you've defined what the change is like, the process, the technology change has been defined. Whereas in this scenario with Gen AI, quite often organizations are actually trying to play catch up. They're trying to keep up with employee-initiated demand because employees are already starting to bring this into the organization. And it gets to the point where you think, well, it isn't about when an employee is going to use this. It's if they're using it. They're already using it in the organization quite often without the structured risk mitigation that needs to be put around it. And so one of the challenges here is that in opposition to traditional change, in this scenario with Gen AI, you got to try and create that mechanisms for employees to utilize Gen AI in the flow of work. And it's in putting in those guardrails, putting in the access that's required. That's quite different to traditional change, where you're bringing the employee along, whereas in this sort of scenario, the employee is ahead of the game quite often. And it's quite often the case of trying to catch up with them. We've all been in this whirlwind of pace, right? And so that's the next idea. It's this pace that there's so much coming out on a daily basis from new advances in AI capabilities, like we've all seen VO3 come through with its amazing video capabilities and the promise of agentic AI, which everybody's talking about. And so that's all happening all the time. And there's an you can easily get caught up in that whole idea of the race. What we're chasing this new shiny thing because there's a new model that's come out. Oh, do we need to use that one? And I think that one of the lessons that we can learn from this element is that we need to think about, and I borrow from Simon Sinek here. He talks about an infinite mindset. And if you've come across Simon Sinek's infinite mindset, folks, but yeah, that's the one that I kind of think about. You've got to apply this infinite mindset. What's superior today might not be superior. It might be surpassed in the next day or two, next week. And so the more pertinent question with an infinite mindset is, how can I, as an individual or an employee or as a business, use these models effectively to drive value in the organization or reduce cost? And regardless of which model you're using, can you create the foundations, the robust foundations that can leverage the technology regardless of who releases it? And so that's much more important than chasing the next new technology that might be coming out. And so that's another idea, when you think about the oversight that you might be needed to make this work. The next one on the list is AI literacy, and when you think about this, in traditional organizational change, we're often building and implementing process and technology change, and then trying to educate the end user. But you can forget about training the end user because it isn't where things are at right now. And so it's a much wider aperture that you actually have to think about when you're considering generative AI. And with generative AI, you might be actually thinking that there's a school of thought that says you actually need to you need to train the whole of the organization. And AI literacy is the really important factor in this. From the boardroom through to the break room, it's right across the organization. And that's quite different because you're not just training the end user, you're training the whole organization around the vagaries of what generative AI looks like. And how do you get to grips with generative AI, which is quite different from traditional machine learning, for example. And then we've got the predictability element of generative AI. In traditional change, technology change in particular, the processes are defined, the technology behaves itself. It's the people that are the unpredictable element. And I think as we move forward in this webinar, we'll be talking much more about that human aspect of these projects, and the technology integration human technology interaction that might be required. And so with 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 generative AI, the predictability has turned on its head. In fact, if you think about it, it's the technology that's as unpredictable as the people. And so the managing change becomes quite different. You're actually thinking about how do you manage not only the people aspects of change, but the unpredictable technology aspects of change. And so you can expect emergent behavior, not just from people, but from technology as well, which is quite different. And so when you think about it in that way, it's important to think about, how does generative AI, how do you avoid things, the unpredictable elements of generative AI, like hallucinations or bias, knowing that you can't avoid them, then how do you prepare for them is the question. And it might need a different mindset to think about it in those ways. And then risks. So risks is another area that of course we need to be aware of. There's so much that's written about the specific generative AI risks. So hallucinations, bias, etc. So you've got all those. You've got the traditional risks, which are things like cybersecurity risks and data protection. All those still exist. But the one thing that we quite often forget with generative AI is that there are use case specific risks too. So in addition to hallucinations and bias and all of those types of things, there is this idea of if you are applying a specific use case, there might be inherent risks with generative AI that were not there as part of technology. So autonomous vehicles is one example. The risk of human injury in autonomous vehicles when things don't go right. That's an additional risk that you might have. The risk in health for if you're putting a use case in healthcare and you think about the associated risks where you get a false positive or a false negative in a health scenario, that causes a whole load of issues with the patients, and so you've got to be really careful about that. And so that's another area where risk come into play that quite often gets missed. And so when you think about it, when you put a program risk register together in delivering generative AI, the traditional risks are there, but you also need to look for those novel risks, and in particular, the use case risks, which may not be there typically in a normal way. And so the final one on my list is just data. And data really is the foundation. Um, and it's the foundation for generative AI because generative AI works on data, right? And so yes, we've always thought that you need data in technology-driven projects, but in this case, you're not just feeding AI, you're actually shaping its genetic code, if you like. And so the rubbish in, rubbish out. I mean, that's pretty normal. But if you get poor data, you can expect hallucinations. If you get hidden biases in your data, you can expect awkward headlines that you have to deal with. And so one of the things that we often think about is treat data with the same care you treat your payroll. It's got to be right, or there's a whole load of problems. And so maybe even actually more care. And so when you think about it in that sense, you got to really think about creating that robust data engineering, uh, annotation, governance, preparing the data, all of those aspects. It's no longer the remit of IT, actually. It's actually much more important because you're putting contextually rich data into AI. It requires contextually rich data, which means the business part of the organization or really need to input into that data cleansing, data preparation. And that's quite different from how things were in the past. And so I guess the idea here is to say that these 8 differences give us a sense of how generative AI might be a little different when you come to implement it than traditional. And because we're putting generative AI into a complex adaptive system, there are interactions between humans and AI. AI isn't as predictable as traditional technology. So you got to kind of intertwine them. You got to manage the expectations of all of your employees who are working on these type of engagements. And this is where it becomes quite a complex challenge, which is why you probably need to think about how do you manage within a complex environment, which is what my colleague here, Aiden, is going to talk about very shortly. And so with that, I will pass over to Aiden, and hopefully I haven't gone past my allocated time there.
Thanks, Max. That was awesome. Really useful context in terms of understanding some of the distinctions between Gen AI and some earlier iterations of AI. So let me just share my screen real quick. All right, super. So I want to take the conversation to the next level of granularity by starting to explore the implications for leadership. So before I just dive into my reflections, I wanted to just give some framing about how I think about this, right? So a relatively simplified version of our focusing question for today goes something like this. What are the implications of implementing Gen AI in organizations? But from my perspective, there are three main elements in this question, right? So the first element is the organizational element. And I think that all of us are thinking of organizations as systems, specifically complex adaptive systems. And I want to give a bit of flavor around what I mean by a complex adaptive system in a few minutes. So that's the first element. The second element is this idea of implementing Gen AI. And what that means from my perspective is that we're actually introducing something really novel into the system. We don't exactly know how it's going to behave. We don't exactly know how it's going to interact with everything else. We can't predict all of these, unintended consequences, right? So there's something quite new that's rattling around in the system. And the third element are the implications, and specifically the implications that I'm interested in are the implications for individual leaders and also for collective leadership. Yeah. So what on earth does all of that mean? I mean, is that just a bunch of conceptual jargon? Like where can we take that in terms of really understanding the implications from a leadership perspective? Well, here's what I think some of this stuff means. So first of all, we're thinking of organizations as complex adaptive systems. And my definition of a complex adaptive system goes a little bit like this. It's the emergent wholes comprising diverse and interacting parts that adapt to changing conditions. So let's talk a bit about what this actually means. So the emergent whole, well, for me, that is the organization, right? The organization is the emergent whole. The diverse and interacting parts, they're all the constituent elements in the organization, the people, the processes, the technologies, the structures, the policies, the ways of working, the customer segments, all of that stuff that's interacting on a daily basis to breathe life into the organization. The changing conditions, well, what could they be? Well, they're things like, shifts in market dynamics or a new market entrant, or maybe just changing customer expectations, or maybe even, broader contextual stuff like geopolitical shifts. And this idea of adapting or adaptability, so what are organizations adapting? Well, they're adapting things like their strategy, their operating model, their cultural attributes, their products and services, their new ways of relating to customer segments. Yeah. So this is the sense in which I'm talking about an organization as a complex adaptive system. So, whoops. So we're introducing Gen AI as something novel into the system. And I reckon that this is likely to make systems more complex by orders of magnitude. And it creates potential for greater adaptiveness, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. So what do I really mean by that? Well, we're introducing Gen AI, and essentially Gen AI is acting as quasi-autonomous agents within organizational workflows. And organizations are becoming more and more like what I would consider a true cybernetic system, right? Because there's novel feedback loops between humans and machines. And so what Gen AI is really doing is it's multiplying interconnectivity interdependencies, because Gen AI is really effective at drawing on multiple inputs and producing multiple outputs. And this really starts to blur the boundaries between human and machine agency. Who's really accountable for this, right? Like, am I just sitting here in the privacy of my own mind making these decisions? Or have the inputs for all of these decisions actually been fed to me through Gen AI? And now we've got this weird blurred sense of mutual accountability that we didn't necessarily have in the past. So in terms of the adaptiveness, why am I less convinced about this? Well, My sense is that what GenAI does help us with is it helps with real-time sensing of things like weak signals and behaviors, and it can identify emerging patterns that maybe are beneath the threshold of human perception. And it can really help us with things like, faster iteration and experimentation and accelerated learning loops, which is awesome. But I'm not necessarily convinced that organizations are going to become more adaptive just because of Gen AI, because I think adaptiveness depends on a whole bunch of stuff. So things like organizational culture and leadership and governance and organizational design and all these other things. So essentially what we're looking at are organizations that are becoming more complex and maybe becoming more adaptive along the way. So where does leadership fit into the equation? Well, there's 1,001 definitions around, what leadership is. My view is leadership is a process of social influence that fosters systemic health. I actually think it's that straightforward and simultaneously that complex. But what that really means is that we need to exert influence in the context of systems that are becoming more complex and maybe a bit more adaptive. And I reckon that's a fairly tall order. Even if we think about our current state, a lot of leaders have difficulty exerting leadership and, leading teams, leading people, leading organizations. And I think this is where leadership becomes vastly more complex and vastly more challenging, which is why we need to really think about the types of leadership that we need moving forwards. So that's just a bit of framing for my thinking. But the question you're asking me is, what are the implications for leadership? So here are some thoughts for you. And again, I want to say here, when we're talking about Gen AI, my perspective is this is still quite emergent from a leadership perspective. So everything that I'm saying here is a little bit, speculative. It's a little tentative. I want to have some humility about these ideas that I'm putting forward because I'm kind of, reading the tea leaves and sensing the signals and working out what might be going on. So I want to kind of hold these ideas lightly. So the first idea, which I think is probably one of the most obvious, is that Gen AI can handle fairly routine and repetitive tasks. And that is enormously helpful because it actually frees up leaders to focus on more strategic, high-value work. So I'm talking about stuff like scheduling and triaging, basic kind of things that happen in the workplace, admin, data processing, critically reviewing documents and these kind of things. So Gen AI can start to function as a kind of intelligent assistant that can play a role in enabling leaders to spend their time doing more meaningful leadership work. Okay. Second, augmentation of leadership capabilities. Well, at the end of the day, my view is that humans are very flawed products of evolutionary biology, right? We can only process so much information. We can only deal with so much complexity. We have all of these inherent cognitive biases built into the way that we've evolved so that we can kind of survive to the best of our ability. And I think Gen AI can play a role in enhancing our strengths and compensating for some of these limitations. So some of the things that I have in mind are things like, synthesizing large volumes of information, generating diverse perspectives that are totally, blind spots to us, modeling alternative scenarios that we couldn't necessarily have thought of, surfacing things like hidden assumptions and acting as a collaborative sense maker. And I think that these kind of augmentations can contribute to, not necessarily, but can contribute to making leaders at least a little bit more effective. Third, reinforcement of collective leadership. It seems to me that, whenever I watch over someone's shoulder who's using Gen AI, it's almost like Gen AI is acting like a quasi interpersonal other. It's almost like they're talking to somebody else, right? And my sense is that Gen AI is creating this space where leadership's starting to feel a little bit more distributed, a little bit more collective, and things like sense making is no longer a solo activity. It's becoming much more of a collective process where teams can sit around a table, we can interpret, we can interpret the output of Gen AI, we can challenge its findings, we can respond to its outputs and say, how do we make sense of this stuff together, right? So my sense is it may play a role in facilitating leadership to become more of a shared social function where we don't just have a bunch of people sitting around a table. We've actually got multiple actors in multiple roles. So we'll have Gen AI taking up one seat at the table. We'll have someone else taking up the role of the questioner, someone else taking up the role of the synthesizer, someone taking up the role of the ethicist, someone taking up the role of the communicator, and these types of things. So my sense is that it's reinforcing the sense of collective leadership. Fourth, the emergence of new leadership capabilities, and this is what I'm kind of really excited about, is that I think leaders have to learn how to manage and collaborate with hybrid human and Gen AI teams. And this fundamentally changes the way that that leaders need to facilitate collaboration, because it's not just collaboration between humans, it's collaboration between humans and machines. And so the kind of things that I have in mind are, basic things like AI literacy, but also things like complexity thinking, systems awareness, ethical discernment, and also managing different types of relationships. Because in my view, having a professional relationship with a human is not at all the same thing as having a relationship with ChatGPT or, whatever other application you happen to be using. Can you sit down with Gen AI and put it on performance management because it keeps spitting out the wrong answer? Can you sit down and, have a disciplinary conversation because it keeps processing information in ways that's totally biased? I think this is where things really start to get quite awkward, because we have to think about the kind of relationships we're cultivating with Gen AI and what that's going to look like. So fifth, the evolution of leader and leadership development. So let me just define my terms here. By leader development, these are terms that were introduced by Professor David Day about 20 years ago, or 20 something years ago, in the leadership literature. So leader development is about developing the human capital of individual leaders, whereas leadership development is about building the social capital of collectives. So I reckon this is where Gen AI really kind of steps into its own, because I think there's opportunities for real-time development. It can continuously analyze things like biodata, behavior, communication patterns, to identify strengths and gaps. It can do real-time measurement of things. It can provide us with ongoing feedback loops and provide coaching hints real-time. So if I'm starting to get a bit heated in a meeting, then I can, see something flash up on my smartwatch saying, Aiden, you're getting a bit stressed out. You need to take a few breaths, bring that heart rate variability back into a state of coherence so that I can access all of my cognitive resources again, right? So things like we could look at things like Gen AI curated development plans, that it's got curated content and experiences to guide individuals to reach their leadership goals, and even things like collective leadership development. So things like group-based reflection based on Gen AI-enabled dilemmas and what have you. If Gen AI could spit out, some ethical dilemmas that we need to wrestle with and think about different perspectives, how we're going to navigate our way through these types of things. And last but not least, and this is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say, but controversy is my middle name, so you just try and stop me. Um, I think, at this point in time, Gen AI does not have reasoning skills as strong as humans. I think we've seen that in the scientific literature quite convincingly at this point in time. However, Gen AI does surpass humans in things like knowledge recall and information synthesis and those types of things. I think that this is starting to challenge the notion that leadership is inherently humanistic. And I've kind of seen this trend on social media that, in leadership, it's all about the people and it's all about being humanistic, and leadership is inherently human work. And I think the introduction of Gen AI fundamentally challenges some of that stuff, because actually, I think that we need to rethink what is the role of humans in human machine systems, and what's the impact on leaders' identities. Because leadership may be less about just leading humans, but actually more about leading socio-technical systems that comprise these feedback loops and dynamic relations between machines and humans. So I kind of think that leadership is becoming less human, more holistic, and more systemic in some kind of intriguing ways. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Brad, who I know is going to do an even deeper dive into some of the other people dimensions. So take it away, Brad.
Thank you very much, Aiden, and thank you, Max and Rory, for those wonderfully insightful and, dare I even suggest, provocative comments, Dr. Hayden, Dr. Aiden Thornton, Dr. Aiden Thornton. Yeah, absolutely. Look, the whole area that I want to touch on, three things in the short time we've got left before we wrap things up. And the three things are the results system that I've been working with now for some 20 odd years. The second thing is the cultural operating system, to speak a little about what you were referring to there, Aiden. And then finally, I just want to make a comment on the finance system. A somewhat provocative comment as well, but that's what we're here to do, is to sort of to push the boundaries of what is accepted and conventional, I guess, wisdom and application in enterprises that are going through change, particularly at the moment through generative AI being applied to a whole range of different roles, if you wish to call them that. So let's just do this very quickly. I'm going to share my screen just so that you can see what I'm working with. And this notion of implementing Gen AI in complex interconnected systems, as you rightly point out, Aiden. I thoroughly endorse and support your comments and yours too, Max and Rory. So let's get into some foresight, side sight, a future sight, that kind of sightedness you were referring to, Rory. Look at the results system. This is this human-centered approach that we've been focused on for the last 20 odd plus years, maybe 30 years, in one form or another. And it looks holistically at the entire enterprise or the living system. So to draw down on the world of cybernetics, this gives you a sort of a human lens. So let's start this very quickly. Ever so quickly, you've got a couple of builds here. So you talked about Synec's wonderful mindset, and I've got a few others that have done this work over the last 30 or 40 years. So just to bring it very briefly and quickly, a couple of different kinds of mindsets that deal with human relation, human connection, human engagement, how we embrace one another or fail to, or if those biases come into play. So we've got this notion of a fixed and a growth mindset. This is Dr. Carol Dweck's work, very wonderful stuff. It's how we see ourselves, how we interpret ourselves in life. And of course, when we step into organizations, we start to draw down on Dr. Terry Warner's work, which is built around the individual and the relational mindset. Well, now, in fact, that has its origins back, if I can go back to Martin Buber's work back in the 20s and 30s as a wonderful philosopher, the I, thou, I, it kind of construct. So this notion of a mindset. Now, I try to treat this fairly simplistically by building this result system from the mindset through to ultimately what emerges out of our relation, out of our connection with one another. And in essence, it goes like this: how I interpret my life, my circumstances, my relationships with others governs how I treat others through my behavior, my actions, and how I share information with them through my communication choices. Okay, so I can either deny or I can embrace. I can either offer or I can withhold. I can either force or I can inquire. There's lots of choices that we make. And of course, that has an impact immediately on the relationship between myself and any one of these other fine people here today. So I connect, I relate, and I respond to those other people in my life. And ultimately, what emerges from those connections is how we do life together. It's the results, it's the emergent characteristics or attributes or artifacts that emerge from those connections. So there's this notion of a result system. How do we go about producing and delivering results in life, whether it's a family or whether it's a university or whether it's an enterprise, whether it's IBM 1 minute or it happens to be the University of Johannesburg or the Australian National University, wherever it might be, or our families. So this is a reasonably helpful view. Now, I want to introduce some work that I'm currently engaged with my good friend, Jim Farrell. And this is because I want to talk about this integration that you referred to, Aiden. This notion of can, will, should human intelligence connect and relate with artificial intelligence, or some people like to now call it alien intelligence. It's got lots of different names, if you will, the carbon and the silicon. Should these things somehow connect? Can they cohere effectively in a dynamic, complex, adaptive system? And I think that's probably one of the most compelling questions at the moment. So let me just bring a couple of thoughts together from my good teacher and friend, Jim Farrell. Jim's about to release his new writing, which is called You and We, and I'm really proud to announce this. In this writing, he's revealing the 4 laws of relation. And I've just popped them on screen here, just scanned them out of his wonderful new book, which you can all get and enjoy very, very soon. But it's really powerful because it's in the context of AI and HI, human social systems that we've been used to now for decades and centuries, and whether or not we can effectively come together and connect in the first instance, but then form relationships that produce wonderful, unexpected, delightful, and emergent artifacts and characteristics, as Aiden would know only too well. Everything is built by relation. That's an interesting statement and declaration. How we interact is who we are. And finally, this wonderful, amazing piece, which is we progress by uniting, to take the point you were making, I think, Aiden, somewhat boldly. And so the way Jim presents this is 4 levels of relation. Now, I'm not going to go into this because I can't do it anywhere near as well as Jim can, but I just wanted to present this to you to give you a sense of this. These 4 levels of relation are profound. And you have to ask yourself, in any kind of human connection, so you have a relationship in your family life or your corporate life, your private or your public life, what level are you at, and what are you doing to move to that next level? And what does that level 5 look like for you? And just to wrap this little point up, I love this quote from Jim, which says this: management of the individual is dead, or soon will be. I think I couldn't agree more. Whether it happens sooner or later, I don't know, but I think this is a really powerful comment. Management of relation is a new leadership paradigm. I think that is something that's really quite, to use your point, I think, Aiden, provocative, and appropriately so, because we are stepping into uncharted territory in respect of integration of generative AI and other yet to be known forms of this artificial intelligence, and connecting that with our human intelligence, if you will. So let me just now very quickly step into the cultural operating system as we know it today, because I think there's a powerful definition here, which I think is worth us holding just for a moment in our quick conversation. The cultural operating system are the written and unwritten rules that human beings employ that are guiding our choices. Those written rules, policy documents and procedures and protocols and performance agreements and contracts of law or commercial contracts, they are written, but then there's a stack of other rules that guide you and I as we step and navigate in organizational life, right? And the interesting thing is that some of those, of course, if you think about your personal life, we don't have a whole stack of rules in our family. Max might have a little post-it note on the fridge to remind him to take the garbage out tonight. I might have one which says, Brad, it's your turn to clean the toilets. They're the kind of policies that we have in family life. But in corporate life, we have these amazing legislation, regulation, procedural policy type documents that most of us struggle with most of the time, in truth. So the measure of a good cultural operating system. Now, I want you to think about this in the context of AI and HI coming together. Okay, so it's not just people anymore, it's people with the artificial workforces that are developing right now. Can they execute superbly or brilliantly or exceptionally well today, and then innovate for tomorrow in readiness for an unknown tomorrow? Because tomorrow is evolving. It's that foresight piece we talked about before, Rory. So thank you. That's Joseph Greeny. I want to share with you very quickly a sample of these are the typical responses that I get when I look at these cultural operating system characteristics. These are patterns of human thought and behavior that are well understood. We've been looking at these for 30, 40 years. So we look at the individual virus. These are virus-like because of how they replicate. This is an example from our ACMP conference last year here in Australia and New Zealand with Deakin University in Melbourne last October. I've done these many times over the last 15 or 16 or 17 years, lots of data, no shortage of data. But do you know what I found from all that effort is that the pattern doesn't change that much. In other words, these patterns of behavior and thought are alive and well, and they speak in many cases to the unwritten rules I mentioned before, and to what Aiden was talking about with these biases, these self-deceptions that we then promulgate with our friends and our colleagues. We amplify them, we move them around, they become significant. So this notion of a cultural operating system is significant and profound. Let's take a few moments to let's have a question or two around the finance system. And this is a really interesting one. I'm going to present to you the idea that the finance system is flawed. Okay. And that is really quite confronting for a lot of my colleagues who are certified practicing accountants and chief financial officers and mums and dads who are making decisions based on the finances of the family and charities and community groups and so forth, whether they're in South Africa, Rory, or they're here in Australia, or our friends in New Zealand, or wherever they might be. So we look at this finance system, and I'm going to present it to you this way. How do we recognize, record, and report the cost of human behavior? Now, if I had a profit and loss statement here, I'd show you that we don't. For anyone who's fully aware of, and I'm not an accountant, so let me put my hand up, but I've been asking this question for a very long time, probably over 25 years. And Most of the people I speak with who've got highly credentialed financial qualifications say, well, we don't do that. Now, I want you to think about this in the context of AI. What is the cost of human behavior? We don't even bother to consider that. So what's the cost of AI behavior? What is the cost that it will bear every day in our organization going forward? How will we record, report, and recognize that? Because we don't do it with humans. Now, if you think about that, we don't do it with humans, and we don't quite know how we're going to do it with AI. Second side of that is the balance sheet. So where on the balance sheet, how do we recognize, record, and report the absolute value of human behavior? Well, truthfully, my friends, we don't. The best that we get is I'm a contingent liability, not an asset. We won't go into things like goodwill for the moment because that's the usual touch point. But the truth of the matter is we don't. And so how do we do that for AI as well in complex adaptive systems? So I want to leave you with this proposition that our enterprise decision-making is often based on. And these words I have chosen very, very carefully over many years of practice in this space and learning. Basically, the data is inaccurate and incomplete. Inaccurate and incomplete. And as a complexity scientist, I know, Aiden, that's deeply concerning to me. I'm sure it's deeply concerning to everyone here. So let me just wrap up my small session here with a couple of comments on powerful predictors for or of successful change that we know from a human point of view. And the challenge from my perspective as an organizational designer is how do I design for this, and how do I integrate this into a future where it's HI, human intelligence, it's people in cultural context, connected and in relationship with Gen AI from a technical and social and whole of system perspective. How do we do that? So here are a couple that I know work extremely well. I'm talking now about the personal, the social, the human at the moment, but I'm curious about how do we make this work for a future where we've got this connected, right? So the health of a relationship, a team enterprise, is a function of the average lag time or delay between when a problem is known, we become aware of a problem or a gap between where we are and where we need to be. If there's a problem, there's a barrier, an impediment or unknown, and discussing it. The length of time. Now, one could argue, and in fact, we know this through deep research over many decades around the world, that human beings lock stuff away in their mental and emotional vault for extended periods of time. I don't want to talk about that. I want to mask and avoid. I've got these biases and these defensive responses that actually have an effect on whether or not we get to keep the lag time short. Okay, some people hold on to things, disappointments, disagreements, misunderstandings. We hold on to these things for an extended period of time. Now, what would Gen AI do? Can we stimulate a reduction in that lag time? This is a major predictor of performance and those emergent characteristics, those results that will come from these connections and relations. Thank you to my good friends, Joseph Brenny, social scientist and author. Let me just wrap up on the last predictor, and it is dialogue. Dialogue is a central element of any model of organizational transformation, says Edgar Schein back in 1994, who was one of my heroes back then. What does dialogue look like? I can tell you right now from the last 30 odd years of my work traipsing around the world that most human systems don't do dialogue. Safe, free, open exchange of meaning between people. We don't do dialogue. We do adversarial, forceful debate at best. So how do we now, these are big predictors of this integration effort between HI and AI, between generative AI and social and cultural systems. And if I go to this point here, that's the social inertia that we're talking about. That's the social norm. That's the social inertia that's going to interfere with whether or not we can produce the kind of futures that we are needing and expecting from our investments in generative AI. It can't be all technology. It must include, of course, that interconnection, that relation between AI, by all means, but absolutely, of course, human beings as well. And with that, I think I am done. That's my point. And thank you all very, very much. Back to you, Rory.
What a mind blow in terms of volume of information, and the way that each of you kind of positioned and presented. Max, we started with you taking us through what is it. Aiden provoked a whole lot of questions around, well, a lot of so what, and then even Brad, you kind of finished us off in terms of now what. So we've actually played with those we've extended the site analogy that I started us with. That we're not just living in this world of our current wineskin, if I can put it like that, our mindset of hindsight, foresight, insight with oversight. We've actually extended it and provoked it a little bit. We've poked the bear. We've talked to some next sight. We've looked in terms of undersight, some of those dynamics that are happening. I think, Brad, you captured that really nicely with the HRAI, and then Aiden, a lot of the questions that you were teasing us on. And then specifically this idea of, be aware of what's happening on the peripheral, that side sight, and then stepping back to the whole sight. So maybe what I'd like to do is just invite each of you to do a quick comment, and let's start in the same order. And Rodan, I'm aware that you've got some gizmos up your sleeve as well. But Max, if I could ask you, just a quick minute or two reflection in terms of your contribution in light of the expanded conversation. Where does that leave us now?
Yeah, it's a really, really challenging thing it's quite confronting actually and insightful when you start to think about where all this could actually end up. And we talked about human and silicon workforces working together. At the same time, we know that Gen AI is not sentient. So we talk about relating and responding, but so it's more of a communication that we're going to have with these. And learning to communicate with AI might actually become like a must-have skill for all of us. And there's everyday prompting, but there's actually prompt engineering, which actually gets the best out of AI. And so when we think about that connect, relate, and respond, we might need to learn like a new language. But we also have to keep in mind that these things are not sentient. They're actually not beings. They don't, at least at this point. And so, maybe at some point they might be, but right now they're not. And so when we think about it, yes, we're talking here about a future where it all could be very, complex and adaptive. It is complex and adaptive today, but it's also got its constraints because generative AI isn't conscious like we are, and it isn't intelligent in the same way that we are. And I think Aiden really described that really well in terms of the sort of things that we can rely on it for and the sort of things we probably shouldn't rely on it for. And so, yeah, absolutely. I guess that's my kind of takeaway.
And Aiden, I was shell shocked with some of your insights around leadership.
Oh yeah.
Maybe your commentary across, having listened with Max, because obviously you picked up, but then Brad's kind of add on.
So yeah, it's I'm just trying to synthesize everything in a pithy way. So for me, I think I would just reflect on the following points. I think for me, socio-technical complexity, I think, has completely outstripped the complexity that leaders can deal with. And for me, that really highlights the limitations of the human condition. And so for me, I think it's about taking a more expansive view of what leadership consists of. And I'm increasingly getting to the conclusion that leadership really has to be the human leadership element big data, Gen AI, and collaborative practices. And those are the four kind of constituent elements of leadership of the future. And that's kind of the line of exploration that I'm interested in pursuing.
Appreciate that contribution, Brad. In terms of our quick process over here, I know you presented, but I'm asking you to apply your lenses based on what is unfolding. And then, Rodan, I'm going to come through to you to see if there are any particular questions that we can throw to our panel.
Thanks, Rory. Look, absolutely. Thank you, Max, and thank you, Aiden. Really appreciate those perspectives. What I would say is, in quick summary, the future is quite unpredictable. That's a statement of the obvious. But there's a point we made earlier on, I think it was you, Max, that the pace at which Gen AI is developing, dare I use the word evolving even, is incredibly quick. And with that pace comes a degree of unsettledness and uncertainty. And of course, human beings in response to that will often struggle. We struggle in the workplace every day. I keep hearing from all my colleagues and friends around the world that they're under pressure, under stress, and in many ways are unsure of what they should or could be doing to ameliorate that, or indeed to respond more effectively to the changes that are right in front of them, because each of us as individuals are complex adaptive systems, and because of that, it's how we see one another, how we interpret our relation or our connection with one another, how we interpret our responsibility with one another. What am I responsible for in your life? What impact might I have in your life and you in mine? That's where this wonderful emergence comes from. Ultimately, is us doing life together, whether it's family, community, or it's workplace, whether it's in South Africa or Singapore or here in Sydney. It makes little difference in that regard. And of course, technology has enabled so much of this in the last few decades in particular. So again, as an organizational designer, and I certainly respect what you're saying, Aiden, in that sense of these are the domains of leadership. But at the end of the day, the job of the leader is to craft, create, and maintain a social system that executes well on mission today, does a brilliant job of whatever it exists to do today, and is ready to adapt, is prepared to adjust again its direction, trajectory, etc. Even its posture in its environment is to be adjusted in tomorrow. It'll be different tomorrow. And so if that's the job of the leader, to navigate this landscape of the social system is changing. And by the way, part of that social system is inclusive of, quote unquote, a digital workforce that's sitting alongside a non-digital workforce. Let's call them human beings like us. Then the leader's job is to focus in on those behaviors that enable that. Right? Those behaviors. So, my good friend again, and wonderful teacher. I've got so many good friends and teachers at my young age, including you wonderful people here in the room. But let me just say this. Joseph Grenny says it brilliantly. And he says this: if behavior isn't changing, you're not leading, to the point you made earlier on, Aiden, about influence and impact. As we lead, we influence and we impact one another. If behavior isn't changing, then we're not leading, we're doing something else. And in my humble experience, we usually try to control and manage something to within an inch of its life today. So we get a certain performance measure, or a lovely metric is achieved, or some kind of number in a box it materializes. And so that's part of our challenge, is what does that look like? I don't think we have an answer here, but I think we've explored some wonderful territory here tonight. And I certainly thank you all for the contributions you've made. And this conversation will continue, I have no doubt.
Absolutely. And I think there is a wealth of new conversations. I'm going to have to go back and re-listen again, because there were real nuggets that I scribbled down, and I need time. Aiden, you said it, you need time to process a little as well.
Well, my friend, I think we are done for our time together today, aren't we?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say
Max?
on behalf
Yeah.
of, I just want to say on behalf of, if I may, Rory, on behalf of ACMP here in Australia and New Zealand, thank you so much for joining us from South Africa tonight. I really appreciate it today for you. I really appreciate that, mate. And Aiden Thornton, Max Thessera, and of course, Radan Kukre, thank you so much for joining us. We've got so much more of this to go. Rory, last few words?
Just again, welcome to this unfolding conversation as it morphs and transforms and opens up new conversations. It's been a privilege and a pleasure. Again, we've moved from our last conversation and we've opened up the next one as yet unfolding. Look
Thank
forward
you
to
very
it.
much. Thank you very much. Okay, well, folks, we'll be publishing this very, very shortly. Hopefully you enjoy it, and please send us back your thoughts and any questions or comments you might want to raise with us, and we'd be happy to introduce you to another topic very, very soon. All the best for now from us, and have a good evening. Bye for now.
Next time.
Thank you so much.